So human resource management has a long history, and it first was labeled personnel management, as it says here on the slide. And it was more focused on administrative things and being a paper pusher and it attracted people who wanted to be people persons. Oh, I want to help people, so people go into personnel management. And it became an area that wasn't respected very well because often people in that department didn't understand business acumen, they didn't understand the numbers, they didn't understand the financials, and all those things. And so we started to see some changes probably in the 1990s, but really it manifested itself in the 2000s. There was an article written in a magazine called Fast Company, and the article title was called Why We Hate HR. And it was this clarion call to HR professionals that we needed to step up to the plate and do better. And it criticized the field of HR because we were not strategy driven and because we were more focused on counting numbers and counting how much dollars we spend on training rather than saying we spent this much on training and this is the impact that it had. So it wanted us to use more analytics, if you will, in the way that we approached doing HR and focusing on strategy as a key issue. So we have now moved from that transactional approach to things to a more transformational approach. We have a seat at the table when it comes to strategic initiatives. We lead through influence and through example, and we set good policies, and we understand strategic initiatives, and we align what we do in HR to that. And this is what makes strategic human resource management really important and effective. In years past, human resource management was underneath operations or it was underneath finance and accounting. So it was thought of as an expense that needed to be managed and controlled. So we only thought about its value in terms of financials, right? We didn't really think beyond how we can make sure we keep our costs down because having employees is always going to cost us money. Then we started to switch, and this was probably in the 2000s, I think if I remember correctly. This notion of the balanced scorecard became an important part of strategic thinking. And what it did is it balanced financial factors and operational factors. And so the four factors that we pay attention to are the financial, of course. We need to understand the numbers. We need to understand budgets. We need to understand spreadsheets. But it also says we need to make sure we're meeting customer needs. And we need to make sure our internal processes are effective and efficient so that we're managing our money well, but we're also being innovative in how we get things done. And then ultimately, in innovation and learning, and having a learning mentality or a learning culture or a learning orientation, where we always are looking to improve ourselves by learning new things and learning and developing the organization as we move along with that. So this was that first foray into this notion of strategic thinking. So now we think, oh, great. We have to think about the corporate strategy, but it's not just about the numbers. It's also about the impact that we're going to have on innovation and processes and people, including customers. We then shifted to this notion of best practices. Like, these are the best things that an organization can do. And at the time, it sounded really innovative and exciting. But what we came to realize is best practices are great if your context matches and if it aligns with your corporate strategy, because not every company can do these things. And that they're not always equally important depending on your mission and vision and the scope of your business. So let's talk about, first of all, what those best practices are, because I think we could all argue that these are important and we should be considering them if they are feasible for the company. Number one, creating employment security that encourages commitment, right? So making sure people feel like they are valued and that they feel secure in their jobs. Selectively hiring new people that are a good fit. Organizing employees into self-managed teams. Compensating them based on their performance at a high level. training them to enhance their knowledge, reducing status differences to make sure there is egalitarianism in the organization, and sharing information to motivate employees, the notion of transparency. And many of these items, absolutely, I would agree with you. Transparency is important. Paying people fairly and well for their jobs based on what your compensation strategy is important. Always making sure we train our employees to have skills. But there are some that don't always make sense in all contexts. For example, self-managed teams. Not every organization and business needs a self-managed team. Now, they're nice, they're great, and probably more times than not, they are a good option, but not in all situations. Sometimes we don't want people working in teams. Sometimes it is better for us to have people working as independents, right? And working independently. Selectively hire new employees. Again, this sounds really good, but really it only sounds good if you're a differentiation strategy company. If you are a company that is McDonald's, for example, you're competing on price, you're competing on, lousy hamburgers and French fries, and believe me, I love McDonald's like the next person. But, McDonald's isn't gourmet meals, right? So do we need to have selectively hired people to cook French fries for us at McDonald's? And of course, we would argue, no, we don't need to do that. So that's also a consideration, right? We don't need to have selective hiring in some circumstances because not all jobs, not all companies require us to have selective hiring. Now, does McDonald's have other areas where they might do selective hiring? Absolutely. So perhaps the people in their top management team, perhaps the people at Hamburger U who are doing the training and development activities, who are developing new products for McDonald's. There we might want to do selective hiring because we're looking for a particular skill set, but not at the individual franchises and not for the fry cook versus the burger flipper. Like, we don't need selective hiring there. Reducing status differences. And sometimes that's a good idea, but sometimes a culture requires a little bit more command and control, and it does require leadership to stand up and to make difficult decisions. And so an egalitarian approach may not always work best for the company. But I firmly believe, obviously, in the transparency and the others. The most important takeaway here is recognizing that while best practices would be ideal, not all contexts require us to do some of these things, like the selective hiring, like putting people into self-managed teams, like having the differences in status removed, and because that's not always an effective way to manage based on your company. And once we understand that, then we recognize, well, let's look at this list. Let's look at these best practices. How many of these can our company benefit from? Even if you do one of them, it can be helpful, right? So maybe we'll do this, but not these others. And that would be a good thing to do. That would be something you could add to your portfolio of strategic initiatives to help HR meet the needs of the organization. Another way to think about strategic HR is thinking about it from a systems perspective. And if you think back to that TOPS analysis, that it was a Venn diagram, right? Where if we made a change in one area, it would affect another. And that's how we need to think about a systems perspective, right? We cannot think of these things as isolated items. We have to think about how all of our practices are integrated and interact with each other. And so we might have some practices that we think are good, but they don't really align with the other ways that we're doing business that are really effective and work really well for us. So we might say, well, we want to make this change, but why? Does it make sense in the system? Does it contribute to the system? Does it contribute to high performance and a good bottom line? And so a systems perspective requires us to think about not just isolated parts of the company, but the whole company, the synergy of the way all of these things interact with each other like a Venn diagram, and making sure that these all work well together appropriately. This last slide addresses how our HR practices can impact organizational outcomes. Um, and this aligns a little bit with what we're going to learn about when we talk about motivation theories in the next module, the next competency, regarding what we call expectancy theory. It's, do we have the ability to perform? Do we have the motivation to do it? And are we given an opportunity to do it to get a good reward? Whatever that reward is, it could be an intrinsic reward where I feel good about myself, or it could be an extrinsic reward. I've got a really good paycheck and a bonus. But the important thing is, if we want people to do well in the company, we have to make sure they have the ability. So we either have to hire the right people, or we need to train them to have that ability. Then we need to figure out how they are motivated. So how do we get them to put forth effort? And there's a whole bunch of things we will talk about in the next module. I'm not going to get into it here right now. But we want to make sure we're creating a situation where people feel motivated. So they have the resources they need to do their jobs, et cetera, et cetera. They have the support. And then we want to make sure that it's not enough to just say, here's a thing, but I don't want you to ever do it. It's like, here's a thing, and here's the opportunity to practice it. And here's the opportunity to implement it. And here's the opportunity to do this job. And when we have those three things, the ability, the motivation, and the opportunity, this can really have an impact on employee knowledge, and it has an impact on our ability to implement these strategic HR initiatives. Finally, I want to think about how all of these things align, right? So we talked about a growth strategy, we've talked about innovation, we've talked about cost leadership and all sorts of things. And there's a whole bunch of different ways we can think about alignment. But this is one example of alignment. And you can think about if the company is a growing company. So if in their life cycle they're growing, they're thinking about different ways and different types of people that they want to hire. They want to think about compensation in a different way than they would if the company was failing. So if you're in growth mode, you want to hire managers who have a growth mentality, who are innovative and coming up with creative ideas and know how to take an idea and implement it and make it get that much better for the company. When we're doing performance appraisals, we want to reward people for increasing our market share and everything that it takes for us to increase market share, which means more sales, more effective customer relationships, that we have good HR practices that allow people to be innovative and implement those innovations. We're going to compensate people for the market growth. So when we grow in market share, we can do profit sharing with our employees in that manner. And when we train them, we're going to train them to be developing their skills so that as we grow, they can grow with us and they will have these opportunities to get bigger and better over time. Alternatively, if we're a company that's not really growing, but we're just trying to be stable and we're trying to manage our costs, because that's the best way for us to manage our profitability when we're not growing, but we're not shrinking. We're just kind of stable. We want a manager who knows how to be a caretaker, who knows how to focus on being more efficient at the way they do things rather than entrepreneurial and creative. We are going to we're going to evaluate people on how well they help us to manage market share. We're going to reward people based on efficiency. So remember I said, if we have a caretaker, we need to make sure we're maintaining our profitability, and we can only do that now when we're not growing and having more sales. We do that by managing our expenses in a better way. And we want to make sure that we are giving career opportunities and different developmental opportunities for people. So if we're not growing, there's not an opportunity to get promoted easily, but that doesn't mean we stop developing our employees. It means we still need to create developmental opportunities for them. So even if they don't move to a different position, we're encouraging them to be even better at the job that they are doing now, giving them opportunities to learn and grow and get to the cutting edge of things that are going on in the market. Now, if we are not growing and we're not stabilizing, then it's very likely we may be failing as a company, or retrenching is another way to put it. We're shrinking for whatever reason. And For a company that is retrenching, we want to have people who are what we call undertakers, people who know how to be very careful in transitioning the company to something smaller and more effective and efficient, and getting rid of dead wood, and underperforming departments and individuals, and really focus on core efficiencies and core expectations. For performance appraisals, really what we want to do is minimize our costs. And if people are doing that, they're working hard to minimize costs, to do cost savings, and to be efficient, then that's what we want to reward them for. What we're going to do is pay them a fixed salary and benefits, because there's not a lot of room for profit sharing, because there is no profit. We're shrinking. But we may do gain sharing. And gain sharing is, as you'll learn when we get into talk about benefits, gain sharing is where we focus on efficiencies, and when we have gains in efficiency and we can save money by doing that, we sometimes share a percentage of those gains with our employees as a bonus to encourage them to continue to think in that manner. Lastly, when it comes to training, we don't have a lot of opportunities, even less so than a stability situation. So we're going to focus on career planning. We're going to do those sorts of things. So let's also think about this in the context of the Porter strategy. If we're in an innovation company, we're very much like that growth mentality company, where we want to have innovative people who are being creative, that are improving market share, that are coming up with innovative and creative new ideas for us to sell to our consumers. If we are a cost leadership company, then we're kind of more like a stability company. We can be wildly profitable as a cost leadership company, which, for example, Walmart is. But we have to think about it like a stability strategy company, where we are really focused on how we can be sure that we are being more efficient in what we do, that we're cutting costs, and we're trying to be as effective and efficient as we can be in order to make things work for us that way. So these are the things that we should be thinking about when we are setting up our corporate strategies. And as you will do for your assignment, you're going to be looking at a company and what it's going through, and help them to develop an HR plan that will be in alignment with their corporate strategy. So that'll be a fun project for you this module.